We continue now at the top of Daf Pei Gimel Amid Beis in Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 83b. The Gemara continues, Boy Ravashi. Ravashi asks the following question, Bor Mahu Shatafsik. Again, if a person sells 3 trees, but let's say there's a pit between them, is that considered to be an interruption? It's not considered to be a sale of 3 trees that can form one unit, and maybe you would not acquire the land along with the trees. Similar question, Amas Hamayim Mahu Shatafsik. What if you have a stream of water in between? Is that an interruption? Rishas Haravim Mahu. What if you had a Rishas Haravim? If you had a public thoroughfare between the 3 trees, would that be considered an interruption? Richva Dedikli Mahu. Let's say you had a row of palm trees. Would that be considered an interruption? And the Gemara says, take with the Gemara leaves these as a question. And the Gemara continues, Boy Minei Hillel May Rebbe. Hillel asked Rebbe the following question. Allah Erez Beinehen Ma. What if a cedar tree grew between them? What would be the halacha? And the Gemara interrupts and asks, Allah, if it grew after the sale, B'Reshusa Didei Nafak, so then already it grew in the Reshus, in the ownership of the buyer, so of course it's going to belong to the buyer. He acquired the land together with the 3 trees, and then later the cedar tree grew. And so the Gemara clarifies the question, revises the question, Elo Haya Erez Beinei and Mao. The question actually is, what if there was a cedar tree between them at the time of the sale? Again, would that be an interruption? And to that, the Gemara does have an answer. Amar Lei said to him, Kana v'kana, he's going to acquire the land, and he will acquire the cedar tree as well. And the Rashbam explains, Boy Ravashi asks, Imtim Salomer. Again, the Rashbam is learning this Gemara as an Imtim Salomer. If you're going to say on the questions on the previous Amud, Tahanach Ein Mafsik, and that all the questions we had on the previous Amud are not interruptions, Mishum Deleka Shum Hefsik Bein Time, there's no actual Hefsik in those cases. We had cases over there where one of the trees was on the boundary, things like that. There wasn't actually an item that was a Hefsik between them. Avalim Yesh Bor Shal Mayim Mechunasim Bein Gimel Ilanos. But what if you would have a pit full of water and it's between the 3 trees? Mao Shatafsik, is that considered to be a hefsik, that they're not considered to be one unit, and you don't get the land together with the trees? Vimtim Salam Deino Mafsik, if you're going to say it's not an interruption, Taholo Mischazu Hamayim Mi Baroi, because you can't see the water from the outside. Aval Amas Hamayim Ma, what if it's an actual stream of water? Vimtim Salam Delo Mafsik, and if you're going to say that's not an interruption, Rishas Harabim, what if you have a public thoroughfare? Kagon Midalat Amos Ad Tazayin, Velo Tazayin Bechlal Mao Shatafsik. For example, you have from 4 Amos to 16, but not including 16 Amos in terms of the separation between them. So what if you now had a Rishas Harabim over there? If you had a Rishas Harabim, would that be considered to be an interruption? And Tosas also notes Rishas Harabim Mao Shatafsik in terms of the question of whether Rishas Harabim is a hefsik lav baroch of Tazayin Ayri. You have to say that the Rishas Harabim we're talking about is not actually 16 amos, because as we've already said, 16 amos already on its own, that amount of space is an interruption, so to speak. Afal Pisha Stomokach, even though in general Rishas Harabim are 16 amos, you'll have to say in this case that's not what we're talking about. And then the Gemara asks Richva Dedikli, what if you have a row of palm trees? Harchavas to call them harbe biyachad. The Rashbam says if you have a bunch of palm trees together, dami lahafsaka tfei mikulu, maybe that's more of a hefsik, more than all of these cases. And then the Gemara asked, Ola erez beinehen, let's say a cedar tree grows la'achar mechira. At first the Gemara thinks the question is after the sale, the cedar tree grows. Ma, what's the halacha? May have hafsaka v'lo yikan karka. Is that considered hafsaka and the karka is not acquired? Hachisal gadai dechashta. The Rashbam says that's what we think right now. But the Gemara immediately asks on that, it already is owned, this area is already owned by the buyer, because if originally at the time of the sale there was no hefsik, so then the buyer is going to get the land. Once he acquires the land, so then already we're going to say, we're going to say the cedar tree is his because it grew in his land. And so the Gemara revises the question, the question is if there's a cedar tree at the time of the sale, and the Gemara answered that question and said, what that means is he acquires the land and the buyer also gets the cedar tree. Like we learned in the Brisa earlier, and he also acquires the trees that are between those 3 trees. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots, Keitzad hein omdim. The Gemara asks, when we talk about buying 3 trees, that you acquire the land as well, what is the formation of those 3 trees? The Rashbam says, Keitzad hein omdin, heich hein netu, and how are they planted? Hani gimel ilanos, these 3 trees. Sheyesh behen me'arba v'yatazayin. We know the amount of space is between 4 and 16, but heich seder netiyasan the kanikarka, in what way do they have to be planted that then the buyer would get the land as well? And on that we have a machlokas amoroim. Rav Amar Keshura. Rav says they're planted in a row. Shmuel Amar Kachatzuva. And Shmuel says they're planted in the formation essentially of a triangle. Rashbam says Keshura Kazeh. The Rashbam has a picture here of a row. V'havei dalet amos o ad yudvav ben kol echad l'chaver. You're going to have between 4 and 16 amos between each tree. And the other opinion is the opinion of Shmuel kechatzuva. He says it's like a chatzuva. A chatzuva is kan sheyesh lo shalosh raglayim. It's, let's say you have a jug that has 3 legs. Echad keneged avir hashtayim kazeh. Essentially something set up on a tripod. Basically, the Gemara is saying it's set up like a triangle according to Shmuel. And the Gemara continues, Man damar keshura. Now the one who says that it's a row, kol sheken kechatzuva. So certainly if it's set up in a triangle, certainly in that case the person's going to get the land as well. That's more likely in a case of a triangle to get the land. Uman damar kechatzuva, the one who says that it's the formation is a triangle, aval keshura lo. But if a person sold 3 trees that are in a row, so then no, the buyer would not get the land. My time, what's the reason the buyer would not get the land? Mishum de mizdra beintayu, because when it's in a row, you can actually plant between them. And if you can plant between them, the seller, we assume the seller retained the land for himself so that he can plant. And the Gemara continues, Maskefla Rav Hamnuna asks, Ulaman damar kechatzuva, the one who says like a triangle, my time adelo mizra beintayu. What's the reason that the person in the case of the chatzuva, what's the reason why he acquires the land? It's because you can't plant between the trees. Since you can't plant between the trees, we assume the seller gave the land to the buyer. But if you're going to say that's the reason, elameata, but according to that, zavin lei, talos higi rumaisa, let's say the person sold him 3 bushes, thorn bushes, means to say Roman thorn bushes, telo mizra beintayu, that you can't plant between them. As the Rashbam will explain, this is even in a row, since it's a thorn bush, you can't plant between them in that case. So hachanami diyesh lo karkar, you're going to say that in that case, since you can't plant between them, therefore now the buyer's going to get the land, because that's the main reason the buyer gets the land is because you can't plant in between. Would you ever say that? And the Gemara says, no, you wouldn't say that. You wouldn't say that. Amar le said to him, Hanach lo chashivi. When you're talking about thorn bushes, they're not important enough that if you acquire the bush, we're going to say you're going to acquire the land. But Hanach chashivi. Here we're talking about things that are important, meaning to say that you have to have both. You have to have both ideas. It has to be number one, that it has to be something important that's being sold, and then you'll say that the buyer gets the land as well. And then number 2, aside from the fact that it has to be something important that's being sold, number 2, it has to be an area that can't be planted by the seller. And again, if you have those 2 qualifications, so then we're going to say that the buyer acquires the land. And the Rashbam explains, Kol shekain kachatzuva, again, if you say we're talking in a row, so for sure if it's in a triangle, the ena karka roy lecharisha, v'lo shayr latzmo, so there already you can't even plow in such a situation if it's in that formation, so then certainly the seller did not leave anything for himself. And then the Gemara asks, Talos higi rumaisa, but if you're going to say that it's dependent on the fact that the seller cannot plant, so if the seller sells three thorn bushes, Roman thorn bushes, senoim, or atadim gedolim kachatzuva, they're big and it's in that formation, first the Rashbam says it's in the triangle, but then the Rashbam says, Velini rafilo keshura nami. It seems to me, says the Rashbam, the Gemara is saying, even if it's in a row, lo mizdara bein time, you're not able to plant between thorns. Shadoagim lalechas b'samachlam, people that want to walk near them, because of the thorns that are there. And so then you're going to say, just because you have some thorns, so suddenly now the buyer gets the land. And the Gemara said, no, hanach lo chashivi. The Gemara said, those are not considered important enough. Higi rumaisa, these Roman thorn bushes are not important. V'anon tarti bo'inan, and we need to have, both conditions have to be met. Chashivas dilanos, number 1, the trees have to be considered important. V'hu de lo mizra, and also it has to be an area that the seller wouldn't be able to plant. When you have both conditions, when you meet both conditions, again, then we say the buyer is able to get the land along with the trees. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Hamocher rosh behema gas. If somebody sells the head of a large animal, so lo machras haraglayim, so along with the head doesn't automatically come the forelegs. Machras haraglayim, let's say he sells the forelegs. Lo machras harosh, he doesn't sell the head. They don't come along one with the other. Machares hakana, he sells the windpipe. Lo machares hakavid, that doesn't mean that he's selling the liver. Machares hakavid, if he sells the liver, lo machares hakana, he's not selling the windpipe. Avol bedaka, but when it comes to the smaller animals, so then the rules are different. Machar es harosh, machar es haraglaim. If he sells the head, he sells the forelegs as well. Machar es haraglaim, lo machar es harosh, he sells the forelegs, he does not sell the head. Machar es hakana, he sells the windpipe. Machar es hakavid, then he sells the liver as well. Machar es hakavid, if he sells the liver, lo machar es hakana, he does not sell the windpipe. And the Mishnah continues, Arba midos b'mocher, and there are four different categories when it comes to sellers and buyers. Mocher lochit and yafos, let's say he sells him good wheat, v'nimtzu ros, it turns out that it was actually inferior quality wheat. So in that case, the lokach is the one that had the bad end of the deal. Halokach yachol lachzor bo. So then the buyer is able to retract. He didn't get a good quality product. Let's say the other way around. Rose v'nimtzu yafos. He sold it to him under the assumption that it was not good quality. It turned out it was good quality. Then it is the mocher who's on the bad end of the deal. So mocher yachol lachzor, but the seller is able to retract. Rose v'nimtzu rose, yafos v'nimtzu yafos. Let's say he sold it on the premise that it was inferior, and in fact it was inferior, or the other way on the premise that it was good, and it was good. Ein echad mehem yachol lachzor, so then no one's able to retract. Shechamsis v'nimtzis levana. Now let's say he sold it, and he said it was going to be reddish brown. It turned out it was white. Levana v'nimtzis shechamsis. He sold it was going to be white ones. It turned out to be reddish brown. Oreitzim shel zayis v'nimtzu shel shikma. He sold him olive wood, but it turned out it was sycamore wood. Shel shikma v'nimtzu shel zayis. He sold him sycamore wood. Turns out it was olive wood. Yayin v'nimtzu chometz. He sold him wine. Turned out it was vinegar. Chometz v'nimtzu yayin. He sold him vinegar. Turned out it was wine. In all of these cases, so essentially it was a different product completely. So then shneim yacholin lachzor ben. So then both parties are able to retract because what was sold was not what they thought originally. And the Rashbam explains lo machres or aglayim. Again, he sold the head. He doesn't sell the legs. Over Tosefta Tani. Now in the Tosefta it says on this b'med devar mamun b'makam shalom nahagu. This is all talking about in a place where they don't have a particular custom. Aval b'makam shanagu. But if it's a place where they have a particular custom, hakol kaminag hamadina. We always follow the local custom in these cases. Hakana again translates literally as the windpipe. He hareya. The Rashbam says this is really referring to the lungs. V'nikras al shem kana shalom. It's called kana because it's just referring. The windpipe really refers to the lungs. Dalid midos b'mochrin. And then the Mishnah said there are 4 categories by sellers. Means to say dalid dinin chaluk and zemizah. Again, 4 different halachas. V'yeluhain. The 4 categories are as follows. Lokeach yachol lachzor bo. You have some cases where the buyer can retract. Mochel yachol lachzor bo. You have cases where the seller can retract. Ein echad mehan yachol lachzor bo. You have cases where no one can retract. And shneyan yacholin lachzor behen. And then you have cases where both can retract. Harei dalid. That's the 4 categories. V'hashtem meforish lahu v'yazil. And now the Mishnah will go on to explain what the 4 categories are. And the Rashbam continues, Machalo chitim yafos. He tells him a good quality wheat turns out to be bad. Hisnalo limchar chitim yafos. The condition was, I'm going to sell you good quality. V'nim tzuros. It turns out to be inferior. So ein ze mekachtos. The Rashbam notes over here, this is not a mekachtos. A mekachtos would be a mistaken purchase. Sheyuchlu shneim lachzor. If it was a mekachtos, both of them would be able to retract. That's not the case over here. Over here we say that it's just the buyer who's able to retract because he got an inferior product. He thought he was going to get something better. Sharei chitin hisnalo limchor v'chitin machur. The reason why it's not a mekachtos is because the condition was to sell wheat, and he did sell him wheat. V'im yishum deros ninu. Now if you're going to say, well, it's an inferior quality, so therefore we should say it's a mekachtos. Ein zu ela ona. That's not considered to be a mekachtos. That's considered to be ona. It's considered to be a case where essentially the price is off from the product. Kagon onoas shasus, like you have a case where it's off by 1/6. V'yachol lokeach lachzor, and the buyer is able to retract. Sharei nesana, because the ona was against the lokeach in this case. Aval mocher shelo nesana, but the seller, there was no ona against the seller. If anything, the seller ended up selling something inferior. He ended up making out better. So lo yachol lachzor, so he's not able to retract. Afilu im hoker hashar de b'shas mechir. Now, even if you're going to say that, let's say hoker hashar means to say, let's say the prices happen to go up. Still, the b'shas mechir lo nesana. We go by the time of the sale. At the time of the sale, the seller in this particular case, it was not the ono was not against the seller. Ela lokeach, rather it was against the buyer, and that's why the buyer is the one that's able to retract. And the Rashbam continues, Ros v'nimtzu yafos. Let's say the reverse case, he was going to sell him inferior. It turned out it was superior. Mocher nesana. So in that case, the ona is against the seller because he's selling something higher quality. He didn't realize, he thought it was going to be inferior. V'hilkach yachol lachzor. Therefore, it's the seller that's able to retract. V'lo lokech, and not the buyer. V'afilu im huzal ashar. Even if later the prices change, again, it doesn't matter. It goes by the time of the sale. And then we had a case of ein echad mehan yachol lachzor, but where nobody's able to retract. That's a case where essentially the terms of the sale were met. V'afilu im hukar hashar. And again, the Rashbam points out, the point is, even if the price would later change, the nesana mocher, let's say the price changes in a way where really now the mocher is the one negatively affected. Oh, huzal ashar, let's say the shar, the prices go down, v'nesana halokeach, and so then it's really the buyer that's negatively affected because now the prices went down, he paid the higher price. One might have thought, maybe you would say that in a situation where the prices went down and now the buyer wants to retract, he can claim gabe ros v'nimtzu ros, let's say by the case where it was supposed to be inferior and it was inferior, ani liyafos Atkavanti. He could say, I really had in mind that it would be a better quality. V'hai damri lachros la'am mishum denisrat seisi ela mishum dera ra yomer hakona. He'll say the reason why I agreed when you said that it was bad is not that I really agreed, but it's just this is what the person says. This is what the buyer says. Kedamar b'gemara. The Gemara is going to mention this. V'chein heichad dehukar ashar. The same thing when it goes up. V'rotza mocher lachzor. Let's say now suddenly the seller wants to retract. Matzitoin gabi yafos v'nimtzu yafos. He can say, maybe you would say he can say when he sold good quality and it was good quality. Rosa yisi savar limchar. I thought I really wanted to sell the bad ones. V'had de'amri yafos. The reason why I said that there was good quality, mishum de tov tov yomer hamocher. The seller always says it's good quality. To me de ra ra yomer halokeach. Since the lokeach always says ra, he says it's bad. Hamocher omer tov tov. This is just something that they say. Kamash malon de tarvayu lo motzu hadri. You see, the Mishnah is teaching us that neither one is able to retract. Hol v'nimsa kamosh amar shnein. At the end of the day, what came out is what they said at the beginning of the sale. V'uadin b'mocher stam shelo pershun. The same is true, says the Rashbam, if nothing was explained. Let's say they didn't explain lo ros v'lo yafas. They didn't say what quality it was going to be at all. In those cases, no one is able to retract. And then the Mishnah had cases where the sale is essentially a mekachtos, because it's totally not the item which was supposed to be sold. So shechamsis, let's say it's a reddish-brown wheat, adumal shem chamish amadimasan, that means to say, again, it's red, the sun makes it red. V'nimtzis levana, that's originally, they think that's what it's going to be, but it turns out to be white. So then shneim to, then they both made a mistake. Tekevan dehisna lo limchor shechamsis, chafetz hayel akif halavana. Obviously, he wanted it to be this particular item, not the other. V'gam alokeach lo yachafetz belavana ki b'shechamsis. Also the buyer, he didn't want the white one, he wanted the red one. V'chein kol hanach tekatani. Also, this is true in all the cases here. To have a shnei minim, all of these cases where it's different items. V'iga denichale b'hai v'lo nichale b'hai. Some people want this kind, they don't want that kind. Hilkach have mekachtos. That's why all these last cases are mekachtos. Ushneihen nisanu. So they're both the owners against both of them essentially. Hilkach shnei and chosrin. Therefore, they can both retract. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Chisda says, Machar lo shava chamesh b'sheish. Let's say the person sells him something that's worth 5, but he sells it to him for 6. So essentially, the buyer is overpaying. V'hukar v'yamar al shmona. But then what happens is the prices go up, and now it actually sells for 8. So even though the buyer actually paid more than he should have at the time, but now the prices have actually went up, the buyer ended up getting a good deal. But the Rav Chisda says, Minasana. But who's the owner against the lokeach? It's against the lokeach. At the time of the sale, the lokeach paid more than he should have. So lokeach so therefore the buyer is able to retract. V'lo mocher, not the seller, mishum, because, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Pei Dalid Amud Aleph.